in, but we're grateful for you joining us wherever you are. Before I introduce our speakers, I just want to run through some housekeeping on how the session will run this evening. It's a webinar, and you'll notice that all participants are on mute. This is to aid the flow of the session and help us keep track of the discussion. We do really want to hear from those of you who joined us this evening, and over the course of the evening you can post comments in the chat, and if there are questions that you want answered, please do post those in the Q&A function. Please do post questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat, so we can keep track of those. You'll be able to see questions that other participants and attendees have posted, and you can also like those, and we'll keep an eye on that to make sure we try and answer the most popular questions and prioritise, particularly if we're pushed for time in the session. We'll also be carrying out some live polling in the session. If you want to take part in the polls, you'll need to have enabled pop-ups on your browser. Now, that's something which is unique to your machine and configuration, so I'm afraid we can't help you with it, but it'll often be in your settings. We'd like to have a quick practice poll so that everybody knows how to use it. So if we can launch that now, please. And in a moment, you should see on your screen a poll asking you, just for a bit of fun, what's the best bit of Christmas dinner? So do cast your vote now. The last few seconds for people to get their votes in, just to test the functionality. Okay, I think we'll close the poll there. And the results are in. It's a close run thing, but trimmings is the most popular part of Christmas dinner, 28% of you voting for that. Roast potatoes is clearly the correct answer. As I mentioned, if you couldn't see that, it may be because you have pop-ups blocked on your device. You've got about 5 minutes or so before we'll come back to the next poll, so there's an opportunity, if you want it, to configure your setup. But don't worry, you can still take part via the Q&A or the chat function if for any reason that's not possible. One last point. In these times that we're all in, if you do have any problems with your Wi-Fi or the session fails and you drop out, obviously feel free to rejoin us. The session is also live streaming it on our YouTube channel, so you'll be able to see it from there, but obviously not participate in the interaction. I'm very pleased to say we've got around 40 participants on the call with us, and I can see that number ticking up as we go. So I'm sure you've joined because you've got questions and want to find out more about the Council's budget context. So I'm going to move on to our speakers in a moment, and I'll just say who we'll have with us. Tonight's session will be led by Councillor Bassam Mahfouz. He's Ealing's Cabinet Member for Finance and Leisure, and will take us through a short presentation on context. At the end of Councillor Mahfouz's presentation, you'll be able to put your questions to him, to Councillor Julian Bell, the leader of the Council, and we're also joined on the call by Ross Brown, the Council's Chief Finance Officer. So I'm now going to ask Councillor Mahfouz to turn on his microphone and to take us through the presentation. So if we can load that as well. Thank you. Over to you, Councillor Mahfouz.
Thank you very much, Kieran, and huge welcome to everybody who's joined us this evening. We know these are really difficult times for local people who rely on our services that we provide, So really welcome throughout the evening an opportunity for you to input with your ideas, your thoughts as to what we should be doing as a council. And of course, and I can already see we've got one of those questions being submitted as well. So please do use that Q&A box throughout the evening to post those questions that you have. So please do use that box as we go through the presentation this evening. But really, really appreciate you joining us this evening. So if we move on to the next slide, I want to start the evening by just saying a huge, warm thank you for everything that you've done and you are doing in our community. The fact that you've given up, your time on a Thursday night so close to Christmas shows how much you care for our borough. And I know so many of you have also given up so much of your time to volunteer for good causes over the past few months, and that's been really, truly heartwarming to see. Like all local authorities, businesses, residents across the country, Ealing's facing some very difficult challenges. We faced a decade of cuts to our services. We've seen an increase in demand to our services. And then, of course, in March, COVID-19 hit, and it's made it all the more difficult over these past few months. But at the start of the pandemic, we led the local response on the promise that the government would cover the costs borne by local authorities to support the local community. The cost here in Ealing was around £71 million, but I'm afraid to say that the government promise has yet to materialise, and we're still waiting for that bill to be paid. We also expect the financial effects of COVID-19 to last for many years and to have a continued impact on our income and the services that we provide. So tonight, I want to give you some detail about the kinds of challenges we're facing and what some of those consequences might be. But I want to be clear that we're not tabling any firm proposals until early next year. But I do hope the information that I'll share with you this evening through the presentation and through the questions will help to understand the context of some of the tough choices that will be to come. And I appreciate not everybody in the room will agree necessarily with the decisions that we'll have to make. But if we move on to the next slide, we can see that, and I'll be coming to you guys for the next poll actually at this stage, a little bit later on. So as you'd appreciate, we set a new budget every year. We look at the projected demand for services and how much income we expect to receive. And included in this, we have proposals that are part of our Future Ealing programme in order to try and transform the services that we provide. And we've worked really hard to change the council so that we can do more with less money and at the same time grow the borough. And you'll appreciate when budgets are tight, cutting our spending alone doesn't work. So we've got to be bold and have strategies to grow if we are to survive as a borough. Before COVID-19, our Future Ealing programme strategy was really getting results and starting to work. But on this slide, you'll see our budget setting principles, our Future Ealing budget setting principles. And these are the rules that we use to follow when we're setting our budget. So at this stage, early on in this presentation, I'm coming to you to get your views as to what you think of the list below we should be using to drive us forward in terms of determining what's the most important things that we should be considering when we set our budget. So hopefully on the screen, you now have the question, which is, we use these principles when deciding how to spend our budget, but which ones matter most to you? You're welcome, unlike the last one where I think, to be honest, the answer should have been stuffing, but hey, you can choose as many as you want. So the first choice is to protect the most vulnerable residents and communities in our society. Secondly, to build strong communities where people help others. Thirdly, to focus on preventing problems before they happen. Next, we have empowering residents to do more. Then we have maximising employment and helping businesses to grow. And last but not least, focusing on providing services that really matter to people. So hopefully, I can see from one participant it's saying that you can only choose one. Hopefully you can choose multiple ones, but if you can only choose one, please choose the one that you think is the most important to you. So apologies if that is the case. I'll give you a few moments to read through those again, potentially and choose. So hopefully you've had the chance to vote. If you haven't, now's your time to do so. And we'll look to close the poll. 3, 2, 1. Yeah, so I'm afraid you can only choose one. So there we go. So you've very clearly said that your top priority is to protect the most vulnerable. So almost 40% of you have said that. And the second top priority there is focusing on providing services that really matter to people. So I really appreciate that, and apologies for the technical issue there about not being able to vote for more than one, but that's really helpful feedback. And again, I urge people to use the Q&A option there to continue submitting your questions as we go through the presentation. So we'll move on to the next slide. And this, the next slide is about our main budget challenges. So as I've said, demand is increasing in some of our most expensive services. Children's services is one of those areas. Now, councils were given extra responsibilities towards young adults a few years ago, young adults with special needs and learning difficulties. Unfortunately, we didn't receive at the same time the funding to match that. So there was a complete mismatch there in terms of extra responsibilities, but not the funding to come with it. That's one area. Homelessness continues to grow is another big example. And of course, you'll appreciate as a local authority, we've got a duty to provide temporary accommodation to those families when they become homeless. And as many of you will have heard me say before, the main source of our income has been cut significantly since 2010. You'll have seen, as I say, for every pound that we used to receive in government grant 10 years ago, we now receive less than 36 pence, the equivalent of £143 million cut to our grant during that period of time. And of course, COVID-19, as with many other organisations and businesses, has hit hard in terms of our income streams. And so they're significantly under pressure. Of course, fewer people using car parks. Our leisure centres have had to close. And sadly, because of the economic fallout of COVID, less people able to pay their council tax. We've led the local response to COVID and the financial impact on our budgets, as I say, was £71 million. It was right that we responded in the way that we did by offering free parking permits for NHS workers, working with local charities and groups to help tens of thousands of isolated people through Ealing Together, and many of you helped in those endeavours as well. We also gave millions of pounds in business rates relief and grants, and we led London in procuring PPE for boroughs at a critical time. However, the government promised to cover those costs, and we're still waiting for them to pay that bill. But all of these pressures are adding up and creating budget gaps in this financial year and next. So if you move on to the next slide, what we'll see is that that core grant that I referred to from 2010 is on a stark downward trend. We're now receiving £143 million less from government than we did back in 2010, at the same time as those increased services. And so far, we had been able to meet that extremely demanding challenge through our Future Ealing programme, doing the things that you would expect of us as taxpayers. We focused on transforming services. We've been more modern and efficient. We've been putting more into preventative work rather than having to deal with issues when they occur and are more costly to deal with. And we've been getting better value for money from our contracts. But if we move on to the next slide, we'll see that our total budget for this year is £248 million. And of that, 60% is still spent on children's and adult services alone. So roughly 140 million of that is spent on children's and adult services. And the next biggest spending areas are around our refuse and recycling services and street cleaning. And then dealing with and supporting our housing priority in terms of supporting residents when they become homeless and covering costs through housing benefit. And then about just over £4 million towards the arts, heritage and libraries. So that's libraries, museums, the Ealing Summer Festivals and community centres. So you can see there where the big ticket items are in terms of our spend as an organisation. So if you move on to the next slide. These are our most recent estimates of the budget gaps. So of that funding that I just talked about, we are still facing roughly about £23 million of a financial gap this year. That was £26 million earlier this year, but actually because of quite significant and severe measures that we've taken to restrict spending within the council, where we've had a spending freeze, we've already reduced that gap by £3 million because of the measures we've taken. There have been some recent announcements by government trying to close that gap a little bit further, but we are still not there in terms of closing it to zero, and we're almost certainly going to have to use some of our reserves to close the gap for this financial year. And next year, at the moment, before we take into account some of the measures taken as part of the comprehensive spending review, and I'll come to that in a moment, that CSR from the Chancellor last week, the spending gap before then was £28 million. So just to put that into context, £28 million is more than we spend collectively on recycling, on refuse, on keeping our streets clean, maintaining our parks, on libraries, leisure centres, community centres, and housing homeless people, as well as maintaining our roads and pavements. So you can imagine the significant impact that's going to have in terms of trying to close that gap in one financial year. But close it we must, because if we move on to the next slide, we cannot legally run a deficit. And I can appreciate you as council taxpayers would not want us to. It wouldn't be the prudent thing to do. But if we can't balance our books, we would have to issue something called a Section 114 notice, which in effect is us declaring ourselves bankrupt. Now you might think, yeah, we're nowhere near doing that. But actually Croydon Council, only a few miles away, have already got to that point. Other local authorities up and down the country are saying, of all political persuasions, Conservative as well as Labour and so on, have actually said that they are on the brink of having to serve such notices. And in fact, the County Councils Network, which is Conservative-led, recently warned that 1 in 5 of their members is concerned about balancing their budgets. So this is a nationwide challenge for local councils up and down the country across all parties. So you can see there, you might ask genuinely, why don't we just borrow more? And we can borrow for capital projects like our home building programme, but unfortunately, legally, we're not able to borrow for day-to-day running costs. You might say, why don't we use our reserves? And as I've mentioned, we are looking to tap into our reserves this year. But as anybody knows, that's effectively going into your savings. And once you've gone into your savings, that's it, they're gone. And you can only use that as one on the one occasion once it's gone, and then you would have to try and replenish it for future years. And all it means is that we cover the cost of that for 1 year, but we'll have to then find it again. So you're effectively paying twice because you have to find that gap again next year. And of course, we can look to increase our income in other ways or spend less. And we've been doing that to a very great extent, as you can tell, by transforming our services, improving efficiency through that Future Ealing programme, which has helped us cover off that 64p in a pound drop. But the scale of the financial pressures that we're facing means that we have to do more to balance our budget. So if we move on to the next slide, you'll appreciate that as a local council, we're also a political body, and we got elected just over 2 years ago on 3 main priorities. First of all, that we want to make the borough a healthy and great place to live. Secondly, that we want to provide good opportunities and living incomes in terms of jobs in the locality. And thirdly, providing good, genuinely affordable homes. So these are our main goals. And alongside this, we have our transformation programme, Future Ealing, which is about making our borough better, modernising the council and providing quality services at a time of drastic cuts to our government funding. We focused on these priorities and our Future Ealing goals, and they've guided our strategy. And so far, in the last couple of years, we've seen Future Ealing save money as well, to the tune of £50 million. And we'll continue to work down that stream to try and help balance our budget. But we know that the budget challenges mean that on its own, it's unlikely to be enough to close the gaps that we're now facing. So move on to the next slide. So what are the options that we've got before us? And again, I'm going to come to you for another poll at this point in a moment. So fingers on the buzzer soon. But Future Ealing has been our response to government cuts so far, and it's worked. And whilst it's saved £50 million over the past few years, clearly, and delivered better outcomes as well for our customers, we'll continue with that, but we also have to make difficult choices ahead. I touched upon what the Chancellor said last week in the Comprehensive Spending Review, but actually during that announcement, he made it crystal clear last week that he is absolutely assuming that local councils will raise council tax by the maximum of 2%. And in addition to that, the 3% social care precept. In fact, he's already built it in, and indeed accounting for over half of what he stated was a 4.5% increase to our core spending powers, or £2.2 billion. So that 2.2 billion that he announced for local councils, over half of it comes from us expecting us to increase the council tax by 2% and 3%, so the 5% in total. So given that that is the expectation of the Chancellor for us to make that decision, what other options available? And given the considerable size of the gap we face, even with that 5% council tax increase, it's still not enough to close the sizable gap that I've referred to. So at this point, I'll come back to you and ask for your views on what you think we should focus our efforts on to close the gap. So assuming we continue with our Future Ealing efficiency programme and increase council tax by 5% in line with the government expectations, what additional measures would you support? So hopefully you should be able to choose more than one on this occasion. And the first one is about increasing our income through fees and charges, things like planning, parking charges, leisure centre charges. The second one should read that we provide statutory services only, so those ones that we have to legally provide. And we stop doing the ones that we don't have to, which actually tend to be some of the services that people may most appreciate. Or thirdly, we spend less on those statutory services that we have to provide in law. So I'll hand over to you now, give you a chance to vote. Hopefully, as I say, you should be able to be multiple choice, but otherwise, if you would like to choose your top option. So I'll give you a few moments now to do that. Okay, hopefully you've had the chance to vote now. So if we look to close the poll. And the priority that you've come back with is that we increase our income through fees and charges with almost 60%. And secondly is go to reduce to statutory services only. So really appreciate that. And I see a comment there from somebody about parking charges, about increasing those. So thank you very much for that feedback. Really, really helpful. Really appreciate that. So if we move on to the next slide, and we're almost coming to an end now, and moving on to the questions, I want to talk about our decision-making timetable. So as I say, no decisions have yet been made. In January, we should have more concrete proposals, and we'd look to do potentially another engagement session with public, with yourselves as local community. We did one yesterday with businesses as well. And then we'll look to bring those proposals to Cabinet meeting on the 9th of February, and then it will come to the full council for consideration on the 23rd of February. So that's the timetable that we're looking to take in terms of the decision-making process. And if we move on to the next slide, one of the things that we've absolutely picked up, and I hope, I'm sure many of you who have taken the time out this evening to join us will fully appreciate, is that actually we can achieve, if we've learned anything from this pandemic, is that we can achieve more together by working together than we can by working alone. And many of you have responded to this crisis and in the past few years by getting involved. And it's been absolutely phenomenal. And I've joined a number of volunteer groups over the past few months as well. And it's really, as I say, heartwarming to see how volunteers have joined these groups. The lager can group, which has just been absolutely phenomenal. Every single weekend, lots of people doing stuff during the week as well, with their clear ups, with their litter picks, and they're working exceptionally well with our environmental services team to work in unison to make sure that we're supporting each other. You've been phenomenal about recycling more, and of course, the more we recycle, the less we have to spend throwing stuff to energy from waste. Being a good neighbour, more so important now than ever before. We've seen that so much through COVID-19, looking out for people when they've been self-isolating. And of course, considering fostering, being a shared lives carer or being a school governor. You can find out more about how you can help in your local community through our Do Something Good website, which is just showing there as well. So, thank you so much for your attention throughout this evening. We're going to go back. I'm going to hand back to Kieran, and we'll be going through the Q&A session part of the evening. So thank you so much again for your time.
Okay, thank you very much, Councillor Mahfouz, for the presentation. So we're moving into the part of the session now where we will take your questions. We've had a number flow in. I think we've got around 20. I will try and get through as many as we can. I can see that both Councillor Mahfouz and Councillor Bell have their cameras on and are ready to answer the questions. Just to recap, I'm going to try and take them in the order of the priority they've been voted for, so we can get through the most important ones. So do vote if there's a question you would like to hear the answer to. And in a number of cases, people have asked questions on similar issues. What I'll do in that case is try and group those questions, and given time, I'm going to then, once we've addressed an issue, try and move on and make sure we cover another issue. So I'm going to start with the question which both members may want to comment on, but I think I'll come to Councillor Bell first, which has come in from Mark Sanders, and it's, why are you borrowing £390 million for property development, which is the investment in the council's company Broadway Living, given the council's financial position? So, Julian, if I could come to you for a response on that one, please.
Thank you, Kieran, and good evening, everybody. Apologies that I've not managed to get in before. I've been having some technical problems, but I've defeated them and I'm here. So it's a pleasure to be here as well. That particular question is a very, very good question, and clearly this is a huge investment that we're making as a council. This is a 50-year investment. We're borrowing £388 million, and the reason that we're able to do this is that it is not coming at any cost to the council. So it does, over the entire period of the 50 years, including at the front end, cover its costs. And the reason that we're doing this is that we have a housing crisis, and there is a huge need for additional genuinely affordable homes in our borough. When we were elected in 2018, we stood on a manifesto that had a flagship pledge of delivering 2,500 genuinely affordable homes. And that was by the end of our 4-year term in May 2022. And in order to meet that pledge, we've had to set up our own council housing company, Broadway Living, and we've also added a registered provider arm of Broadway Living in order, and that's the delivery mechanism, the registered provider arm for the majority of our work in this area. So it will allow us to hit that 2,500 genuinely affordable homes target, and significantly, we will use a lot of our own land, and we will do the borrowing as well. But it will come at no cost to the council taxpayers in terms of monies needing to come out of the general fund. We're able to cover those costs, and therefore that's why we're going ahead in what are obviously challenging times. There are also, in addition to the really positive effects of people having new genuinely affordable homes, there will be a dividend in terms of additional local jobs, apprenticeships for our young people through building these homes. And it will also stimulate the local economy, and local companies will be able to help us to build these homes and benefit from this big investment. So it will have those wider positive economic stimulus effects, as well as providing those genuinely affordable homes.
Thank you, Councillor Bell. Very full answer to Mr. Sanders' question. I'm going to come next to the question from John Ashdown, and I'll come first for a response to Councillor Mahfouz. Mr. Ashdown's question is, how many council employees earn over £75,000? And do the panel think, given the budget context, there should be a pay freeze for higher paid council employees? So Councillor Mahfouz, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kieran, and thank you, John, for the question. So first of all, to answer the question, in the short answer is there are 56 employees who earn above that figure, including pension contributions. And to answer the second part, yes, their salaries, as with anybody earning over £24,000 who's a council employee, their salaries will be frozen next financial year. But I think what you will appreciate, John, is that we have done a full review in terms of the management across the board, and we're always looking at savings in management as well as in other areas. And in fact, only last year we took the decision to remove 2 executive directors from the council's payroll in terms of the structure as well. So we're always looking to make savings at that top end as well as in other areas, as you would expect us to, John. So I hope that answers that question.
Thank you, Councillor Mahfouz. I can see Councillor Bell's camera's gone off. I don't know if he's still with us or having some technical problems. Julian,
No, I'm still with you. I'm doing a bit of juggling because I was going in my emails to find the file that had all the questions in it so that I could see them, but I can't do it without it turning my camera off. So we'll fly without any power. We'll jump out of the plane without. No, that's not a good analogy, is it? We'll fly. We'll fly without our what do you call it? Your altitude metrics and things. We'll do the best we can.
Okay, well, it's great that you're back with us, Julian. So I was checking.
I mean, so yeah, sorry. I could just add to John's answer in terms of so I think it's £1.4 million that we've saved last year alone from the management savings that I referred to, and over the sort of longer periods over the last 2 years has actually been just over £3.8 million worth of savings around management and staffing. So just to give you some of that context that I think John was possibly looking for there.
Lovely, thank you, Councillor Mahfouz. Now I was going to take next, there's a number of comments or questions on the issue of low traffic neighbourhoods, which I know is an important local issue. I'll summarise the questions or comments as a group, if that's okay, and then come to Councillor Bell first. So the first comment, I think, is from Penelope Fletcher, just saying please stop low traffic neighbourhoods and don't set any more up, expressing the view that the consultation hasn't been democratic. We've also got a question from James Wong, which is whether the LTNs are a local project or are we required to implement them by the GLA or central government. And I'll just scroll down, because I do believe there was one more comment, yes, which came from Cy Phillips, which was an example of his mother who lives outside the borough but comes here to deal with childcare, and proposing there should be consideration of an exemption for LTNs for the over 70s. So, Councillor Bell, if I could perhaps ask you to pick up those 3 points: the consultation, the arrangements in terms of GLA and national policy, and specifically the consideration of any exemptions from the scheme. Thank you, Councillor Bell.
Thank you very much, Kieran. So in 2018, when we stood for election, one of the commitments that we made in our manifesto was to implement various active travel schemes promoting walking and cycling, including low traffic neighbourhoods. And this was also Labour Party national policy in last year's general election as well. Equally, it's Conservative government policy as well. And this was something, in fact, that there's been cross-party agreement. The Liberal Democrats have supported this as well. So the government basically said back in May, Grant Shapps, the Secretary of State for Education, asked local authorities across the country to implement active travel schemes, including low traffic neighbourhoods, in order to give over to pedestrians and cyclists more road space, and to help us to avoid a car-led COVID recovery. We know that there's less capacity on public transport, on our tubes and buses because of COVID. And if everybody who was making journeys on public transport previous to COVID then just jumped in their car, we would end up with total gridlock. And so what local low traffic neighbourhoods are an effort to make it safer and easier for people to walk and cycle. And yes, it is difficult at times, and it does require people to make some sacrifices. They will have to make longer journeys sometimes, although their homes are always accessible through a low traffic neighbourhood. But the idea is that you reduce the traffic within the low traffic neighbourhood and it becomes much easier to walk and cycle. 30% of local journeys that are under 2 kilometres, and it's how we can move to get some of those car journeys, short car journeys, made by walking and cycling. So the consultation question, it was the government's clear indication to councils and TfL as well, were instructed by DfT that we had to put these in very quickly, and that only minimal consultation would be allowed to be done. Otherwise, we didn't meet the funding criteria. And if we'd have had more chance to do more consultation, I think there's no question that we would have done that. That's what we always normally do, but it was clear from the government that we were not able to do that in this first round of low traffic neighbourhoods. James Wong's do we have to do them question. I believe Hillingdon have not done any low traffic neighbourhoods, so it's a choice that we have made. It's a choice that we've made because of our commitment in our 2018 manifesto to do this. And it's a choice for three big reasons. And these are the things that I'd really ask people to think about when they reflect on low traffic neighbourhoods. We have a climate emergency and a climate crisis. This will help us to tackle the climate crisis. We cannot go on being so dependent upon our cars. We have to have more people using sustainable methods of travel, walking and cycling. There's an obesity crisis. The NHS, it costs billions every year to the NHS because of obesity. And again, active travel is a brilliant solution to resolving those challenges of obesity and the costs that it's piling on our NHS. And then finally, we have an air quality crisis. Over 9,000 people in London will die prematurely each year because of poor air quality. Nitrogen dioxide from vehicle emissions is a primary cause of those premature deaths. Poor air quality is a silent killer, and we need to reduce the number of car journeys right across the board in order to tackle that air quality, poor air quality and the air quality crisis that we've got. So in terms of exempting over 70s, we have made two concessions and in a recent cabinet report that we agreed this week. And we've said that essentially people with blue badges that live within low traffic neighbourhoods will be given an exemption to go through the cameras that are in the LTNs, their LTN. We've also said that we're going to replace bollards with camera enforcement, having had further feedback from our emergency services. Thank you, Kieran.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Bell. The questions are flooding in, so do keep liking them because it'll help me manage and make sure we get to the ones which are most pressing in terms of a view. I'm going to come to Councillor Mathews next, and we've got two related questions on alternative sources of income. One, how much additional council tax has been raised as a result of new development over the last few years? And then a question from Dan Lala about what are our other plans for raising revenue beyond council tax. So Councillor Mathews, if you'd like to take those, please.
Thanks very much, Kieran. So first of all, in terms of Francesco's question there about the income that we receive from additional number of properties within the borough, more people living in the borough and so on, it's what we call the council tax base, so the number of people eligible to pay council tax. Roughly speaking, every year that accounts for about 1% growth in what we call our council tax base. So that's roughly what it's meant over the past few years, and that equates to roughly 1% at the moment in the current terms of £1.4 million extra per year. But we tend to build that in to the assumptions that you've seen presented this evening. Now, in terms of other ways of raising revenue, we have a number of options that are available, and of course, as well as create efficiencies throughout the council, we also look to maximise the grants that we have available to us. We tend to increase our fees by the rate of inflation. So these are a number of different fees, from planning charges to parking charges, and all those other services that we are entitled to charge for. The basic principle that we've taken so far is that they should increase by inflation every year. Our costs tend to increase by, as you can see, by more than that in many areas. And we've also taken the principle that actually, for many services where they're not statutory in particular, we shouldn't be running them at a subsidy. So those people who don't use that service shouldn't be paying for effectively services that are being provided to people who do use those services. So we've tended to increase those fees and charges accordingly. So, I mean, there's a whole list of fees and charges that we tend to look at and review, and it forms a whole report in itself, which goes on to usually about 30 pages long. But I'm happy to share the link to what it looked like last year. We're also incredibly sensitive to some of the fees and charges that we have, and conscious of those every year. Things around burial costs and so on. We do take very sort of appreciate what people are going through with that grieving process as well. So we try and take all of those things into account when we look at our fees and charges year to year. But I hope that sort of goes some way to answering the question.
Thank you, Councillor Mahfouz. And I'm going to stay with you for the next question, which has got a lot of likes and people clearly would like to know. So it's from Elizabeth Pace, and the question is, how much does Ealing have available in reserves? So I'll come to you, Councillor.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So that currently sits around, in totality, about £90 million. But let me put a huge caveat on that, because actually for most of that £90 million, most of it we can't really touch because it's actually ring-fenced for the private finance initiative reserve that we have to ring fence, which supports those schools that were developed by PFI. There's also a schools reserve and housing revenue account reserve, which are included in that figure. And so we're not able to touch many of those reserves because they are set aside for specific purposes. And that figure has come down over the past few years. We have been using our reserves in order to, wherever possible, to make sure that we balance our books rather than going out to increase charges or council tax and so on to close those gaps. But you can see by the size of the gap, we've still had to do that in many other areas as well. Now, in terms of actually, what would you see us actually being able to get our hands on and use as reserves? It's around £20 million that is, or less than £20 million that we actually have any real flexibility to use in year to balance our budget. So that's the sort of real figure in terms of how much we actually have available to us. So that is less than the gap that we have this year alone, as I've said. So that gap at the moment, as it sits, £23 million. We would have to use all of our reserves if we weren't able to close that gap further through additional government funding and through additional severe restrictions on the spending that we make internally. Just to put it again, a bit of context, last year we used £15 million of reserves alone to plug the financial gap. So you'll appreciate it's our last line of defence, and we, like many of you, you appreciate that you do need savings, even more so during the tough times. And so we need that resilience going forward. So it's that last resort in terms of tapping into it. But roughly speaking, less than £20 million of actual usable reserves. And last year we used 15 million.
Thank you, Councillor. The next grouping of questions I'm going to take are both from Jasdeep Singh, and they're in terms of councillor engagement. And I may come to Councillor Bell first on these. So one is a suggestion that councillor reimbursement should be reduced. Councillors should be volunteers. And the second question, I think that's probably more of a comment, the second question is about the way the council engages, specifically about ward forums and whether they might be able to be held digitally like this webinar today. So Councillor Bell, if I could come to you on those comments and questions, please.
Yeah, thank you, Kieran. Councillors work extremely hard, and they very often have additional 9 to 5 jobs as well as being councillors. They're also kind of taken from a very wide spectrum of representative spectrum of the community. So we are given allowances as councillors, and pretty much since austerity started in 2010, councillors have made the decision that we would freeze our allowances and not increase them. I think in that 10 years since 2010, and since I've been leader of the council, I think 1 year in 2014 we put them up by whatever the amount was that the public sector pay rise was for all of our employees in the council and in local authorities. But for 9 out of those 10 years, we have chosen not to take any increase in our councillor allowances, and I think that's probably the right balance between recognising that times are tough and we don't want to put any additional burden on the council's budgets from our own allowances, especially when we're having to make difficult decisions. But equally, we want to ensure that we don't kind of get in the position where people have to use their own money to be councillors, or councillors can't afford to be councillors because they're giving up time in which they would need to keep working in order to kind of make ends meet. So it's having what I think are very modest allowances when you compare them with other boroughs. They're very modest, and I think we've got the right balance. In terms of engagement and digital online ward forums, absolutely, I think this is one of the advantages that we've got, and one of the silver linings of COVID is that we are having a lot more engagement digitally with people, and that's, I think, has been really good. At the moment, we have suspended ward forums because the support officers in the council who would normally support our ward forums and help us with different spending on projects that ward councillors choose have been redeployed to respond to COVID. They've done a fantastic job on the Ealing Together food parcel delivery that happened in the wave 1. They've been doing online meetings tonight in certain areas. I know that there was a Perivale, Greenford and Northolt one that covers my Greenford Broadway ward tonight, that team were doing with public health and with other community representatives to talk about COVID and to talk about how we can tackle some of the problems of getting people to take tests, to self-isolate, and to overcome any fears about being vaccinated. So when we kind of get through COVID, we will go back and start our ward forums again. We are looking at different ways of engaging, though, in the future in what we call thriving communities. So there'll be a period in 21-22 where we kind of do ward forums, and I would imagine that we would want to do some virtual ones, but we'll also be looking at seeing if there are different ways besides the kind of traditional ward forum model to engage better with our communities. And clearly online virtual meetings are one of the tools that we would want to use.
Thank you, Councillor Bell. I'm conscious of time, we've got time just for a few more. There's a number of questions, Councillor Mahfouz, on the theme of the COVID spend, the £71 million you mentioned. So a question from David Knight about whether the budget gap figures you mentioned included that, and also a related one from Simon Higginson about whether it's normal to run in arrears in terms of money from government. So perhaps you could take those.
Thank you very much for those questions. So in relation to the £71 million, just to sort of go back, rewind, before, well, right at the very start of this crisis, and in fact Councillor Bell was on the phone call when the government minister made it crystal clear that every penny spent in terms of dealing and leading the combat against COVID-19 at a local level was going to be recovered, and that bill paid by central government. And so we went out there and we've been supporting local charities, local organisations, local businesses. We've been, as I say, leading the charge in terms of making sure that every borough across London had the PPE at that critical time when you'll recall that PPE was at a premium and couldn't be found. And so we've been doing that solidly hard work over that period of time. And so the bill, both in terms of extra cost, in terms of lost revenue, in terms of savings that we had on the table that were not being able to be achieved, has come to a total of £71 million. Now, like many of the businesses that we have across the borough, what we've had as a result is that the reality has not met the promise that we were given. And so in these past few months, we've had a drip feed of a few £1 million here, a few £1 million there, a few £1 million there. We have had to wait almost hand to mouth to find out what the government's next announcement will be in terms of how far they will look to close the gap of that £71 million as those costs at the same time have been growing. And so, yes, a lot of the £71 million has actually been now funded or committed to in terms of funding from government, but we are still being asked on a regular basis to do more to support the charge against COVID-19 on a local level. And so we're still incurring additional charges, additional services that we have to provide for, and some of the additional income that we're receiving is purely ring-fenced to try and fund the services that we're being asked to deliver. So yes, the £23 million that we refer to there, a significant chunk, over half, was actually the unpaid COVID-19 bill, which is about £14.8 million at that point. We've had subsequent announcements to close that a little bit further still, but we need to know, in the same way businesses need to know exactly what's in store for them if they're going to be able to operate properly, is that we need to know exactly how much we are going to be receiving in order to close that gap, because otherwise it's really, really difficult to run a business, let alone an organisation that's providing critical services on the front line day to day to our residents. So that's the challenge around the 71 million. In terms of the second half of that question, Kieran, was...
The second half was just, was it normal for there to be a delay in receiving funding? Obviously nothing about COVID is normal. But
no, sure, absolutely. I was going to say, I mean, this is, how many times have people said it, this is, the most unusual circumstances anybody's ever faced, in terms of a pandemic, which has meant a recession, which has not been seen for the likes of for 300 years. We still don't know what the full outcome is going to be. We're still, we don't know what's going to happen from one week to the next. So these are very unusual times, and nothing is normal. But I think, clearly we need, what is usual in these sorts of circumstances, and if we are to learn anything from the last 100 years, is that in circumstances like this, governments need to step in to make sure that they close those gaps, put the money in order to rebuild the economy, make sure that there is that job security that people need, make sure that the confidence is there amongst employees, amongst families, amongst residents, so they will spend money in our shops and services, because otherwise it will be a downward spiral like one we've not seen before in our history.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. I'm conscious there are a lot of questions and a lively discussion in the chat, but we are almost at the end of our time, and we're not going to be able to cover every question, unfortunately. But before I wrap up and outline the next steps that we're working through in our process, I was going to ask each of the panelists if there are any closing remarks they wanted to make, or any additional comments they wanted to emphasise to people we've got with us on the call this evening. Councillor Mahfouz, perhaps I'll come to yourself first.
Thank you. Thanks, Kieran. And look, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this evening. Really appreciate that you've taken the time out to sit with us this evening and your questions. And I'm really sorry that we've not been able to get through all of the questions that you've asked in the time that we've had. And when somebody asked about ward councillors and what they do, and I can see through the list a number of my local ward residents in on this meeting, you'd appreciate that many of us are actually, particularly myself and Councillor Bell, are very easily contactable. We're always happy and there. And this evening is about this, the start of a conversation. It's all about that engagement in terms of speaking to you two ways in terms of what we're doing, why we're having to make these changes, trying to get your feedback as to where we should go as a borough in these most challenging of times. But I say to you from my heart, thank you so much for everything that you've done in these past few months. Thank you for trying to control the pandemic, the coronavirus across the borough. Thank you for all of the volunteering that you've done, whether it's through the food bank, whether it's through your local schools as governors, whether it's through Lagercan and other local community groups. It's just been absolutely phenomenal. Or even if it's just looking after your neighbour down the road, we can't achieve what we want to achieve as a borough just by working as a council. We work with you as local residents in order to achieve that. And so, grateful for you joining us this evening. We'll continue this engagement as we look to make the decisions that we have to around the budget. And I look forward to speaking to many of you, over the next coming weeks and months. And really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Councillor Bell, were there any final comments you wish to make?
Yeah, just briefly, Kieran, thank you. So we're fighting this COVID-19 crisis, and I'll kind of come on to that in a minute, but there are other huge crises that we're having to deal with which haven't gone away. And I think the number one is the climate crisis. And I think many of you will have seen the David Attenborough programme a few months ago that was aired, and looked at that with some dismay and despondency and discouragement. But unless we do something individually and collectively as Ealing, we'll just be giving in to despair. And so, we've declared a climate emergency. We've set a target to try and get to net zero carbon by 2030. And as Councillor Mahfouz has said, with COVID and all the challenges that we're facing, we can't do any of this without you. And certainly meeting that climate emergency and that net zero carbon target, we can't do it as a council without the participation and the sacrifice of all of our residents to try to move to more sustainable modes of travel, and do other things that will help us to meet that target. The final thing I'd say is that we are kind of teetering on the edge of going into tier 3. I've had meetings with other council leaders and the mayor and Matt Hancock this week, where we've been talking about what can be done prior to that decision that needs to be made on the 16th of December to try and stop us going into tier 3 for two very good reasons. Obviously, more lives will be lost, and more pressure will be put on the NHS if we do see a worsening of this pandemic in London and in Ealing. And also the economic costs will start to build and increase as businesses that are already on their knees are really fighting to keep going and to survive. And they need this period just before Christmas to at least give them a fighting chance of being able to survive. Now, what that means is everybody individually has got to take some responsibility and follow the rules themselves personally, but also remind others. And so I'd really implore you to follow those rules as carefully as you can, and get your family to, in order for us to avoid further loss of life and also the damage to businesses in our local economy, which, you know, the cost of it will come back to the council in terms of our budget, and you know, it's all just making things tougher for everyone. Thanks, Kieran.
Okay, thank you to both our panel, Councillor Julian Bell, Leader of the Council, Councillor Bassan Mahfouz, Portfolio Holder for Finance and Leisure. Thanks to my colleague Ross Brown, our Chief Finance Officer, who's been supporting and in attendance. Most importantly, thank you to you, local residents, for giving up your time this evening to contribute to the discussion and ask your questions. In terms of next steps, you'll get tomorrow, in the coming days, an email from an address talkfe@ealing.gov.uk. So please do look out for that. Do feel free to respond to us with any feedback, any specific suggestions on savings proposals or ideas that you think we should consider. We will review them all. I'm afraid we can't commit to get into a sort of dialogue on the proposals received, but I can assure you that they will be reviewed and fed into the process. I really hope you found the evening informative and useful, and a good use of your time. Certainly the quality and focus of the questions has been excellent, I think, so thank you for that. As Councillor Mahfouz said in his introductory remarks, the Council does plan to hold some further sessions to say more about specific proposals as we move towards setting the council budget in February to the timescale he described. So please do look out on our communications channels for information about how to join that session, which will of course be important. Should you wish to watch again, a recording of this session will be on YouTube, on the Council's YouTube channel. But finally, from me and from all our panellists, thank you very much for your participation, and good night and have a lovely evening. Thank you.